Bob, solo tabletop gamer. So it goes without saying this year that has just been a year of years, and lots of things have changed. Um, there's just so many things that I think well, we're gonna have to get used to being different from what we consider the normal, if you will. And Halloween being no different. And yeah, so I decided this year I wanted to do something. And I sat around and I thought for a while, and I was like, what could I do? Because let's face it, Halloween is just not going to be the same this year as it has been in years past. And I thought, well, maybe I could do a one off game. Maybe I could do something in an RPG that kind of has like a Halloween theme for it. You know, all these ideas that I had just running around my head. And it was at that point, as I was sitting here throwing these things around my head and thinking, that I had decided, well, why not tell the story? It's a true story that happened to me and my family that we endured for 3 years, and tell that here. It's the time of year for it, and considering that I think for most part nobody's Halloweens are going to be, how do I put this, as we remember them in the years past, I think it's a really good thing, maybe. So, without further ado, I'm going to get into this. A couple of disclaimers I'm going to get out of the way first. First and foremost, if you like the video, click the like button. And if you haven't subscribed, click the subscribe button followed by the bell icon. Every time I upload a new video, you get notified. Second disclaimer I'm going to put out there is just to realize that what I'm going to tell you is a true story. Everything I'm going to tell you, me and my family endured. It was terrifying. These things are real. These things are out there. Um, Today, one of the issues, I'm not going to say issues, it's not an issue. That's the incorrect word. Today, we are over inundated with footage of hauntings and all these other things that we see. All this uh, footage that is caught and presented to the public, and I think there's this overall perception that this is like an innocent endeavor, if you will. And I'm just going to give you one word of advice. These things are real. These things can plague and haunt your life, and these things can follow you. So, for those of you that are looking to go out and maybe do a ghost hunt, maybe go visit somewhere that people may have said they have had certain experiences or what have not, just be very careful before you do and think about it before you jump on in, because unlike many other things in this world, it's one of those things that you find out you have no control over. So, when I was 14, was it? Yeah, yep, I was 14. When I was 14 years old, and I didn't understand it at the time, my parents, we had to move. And so they were looking for housing. They wanted to go further west of where we lived, but they couldn't find anything at that time. But we had to get out of the place we were in at that time. And they were on a deadline and they were on a crunch. And they were also limited on money and just everything else that plagues us at that time. They found a house that they were able to rent that was within their price range and was local and was opened up for immediate occupancy. The place is located in Wixom, Michigan. I'm not going to give you an address or anything like that, because for those people that are people, that's funny. Um, Nobody stays there more than 3 years. I should just get that out right now. Anyways, I just don't want to put that address out there. It is located in Wixom, Michigan, and it is off of Potter Road. Um, and I'm not going to see any more than that. That's where I'm going to leave it. So my parents had gone and looked at this house, and they said, "Hey, we're going to go meet with the landlords and see if we can get it." They didn't have many options. So as we pulled up in front of this house, my first impression right away was just I didn't like it. It didn't feel welcoming. Um, the minute I got out of the van, it felt as if, um, almost as if like I was being told to leave. So we went inside the house, and it was old. There were areas to where the drywall needed finishing. It had wood plank flooring, not carpeting, that had to be redone and refinished. Overall, the house was an old house. It had a very unwelcoming feeling to it. So, as we were looking around, as when you're young, you're adventurous and you're curious. And I had broken off from my parents and the rest of the group, and I went upstairs. And I remember walking upstairs into the master bedroom. And when I went in there, as you looked out at that time, it was all woods behind the house. I remember looking out the window and having the overwhelming feeling. If you've ever been in this situation, you understand it. This isn't like walking past a high voltage source and feeling that, if you will, stagnant energy. I don't want to. I guess the best way to put it, or you may feel your hair stand on end or your skin tingle. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is having the feeling as I'm looking out the window, something's looking back at me. Um, and I literally frozen in fear, and I didn't know why because I couldn't see anything, but I could feel something. It was at that time my parents and the landlord came up there, and they were, hey, what's going on? And my parents were talking with them and decided to, at that point, rent it. And I remember voicing my opinion to my mom and telling her that I just didn't like the place, that it didn't feel right. And she reassured me it was an old house. Now, granted, I didn't understand because I was too young to understand at the time the situation that they were in. The fact that they had to leave the house that they were in. It was at that point, things were tough, and my parents didn't talk about it a whole lot. Financially, they had lost the other house, and we had to go. And that wasn't disclosed to me. That was, my parents didn't want me to worry or have any stress about that, so they really had no other options. So within about a month, we had moved in there. And I remember that was the 1 year that, while everybody else across the country was enjoying their Thanksgiving dinner, we were moving. And it was cold as hell. So, anyways, before we actually moved in, I'm getting a little too far ahead of myself. We had went in and painted, as the landlord agreed. We'd go in and paint and change things like that as we saw fit. Um, Obviously, to make it livable. So the bedroom that was to be my bedroom, um, the people that were there before us had painted these weird cartoon characters on the wall. There was a a Donald Duck. There was a Felix the Cat. Um, I want to say there was a bad rendition of a Mickey Mouse that was also on the wall. Anyways, it was just eerie. It was eerie the way that they were painted, these big black eyes looking at you. And when we had moved in, we painted over that. And except for whatever reason, my mom, because Felix the cat was like part of her childhood, was one of those things that she remembered growing up. She's like, hey, you should keep this. It's kind of cool. So she had talked me into it, and I had agreed. And we had painted the room, and we decided to go with a blue color because that was my mom's favorite color. So that's the color we went with. And of course, we had to paint the rest of the house. And by the time we got done with that and getting the house ready, it was around Thanksgiving when we finally moved in. So, as it would go with most old houses, if you will, um, anytime you stay in a new house, your first week or so, you have a hard time sleeping because you're just getting used to all the new sounds, the creaks the house may make at night, and things like that, that you just have to get accustomed to, and then you learn to ignore those things. So, with this house, the weird thing that had always happened was it started out very subtle and almost as if you would think it was the wind at first. And that is, you would hear what sounded like a tapping that would occur on the wall. Well, at first, because my parents thought it was me, and I thought it was my parents, and after the first month, they said, hey, are you tapping on the wall at night? Or is there something? And I said, no. I said, I thought it was you guys. And they said, no. So within about the third month of me being there, I had met uh, another kid my age that lived on this street. And that's when I kind of learned a little bit of the history. This road, if you will, and it was a dirt road off a main paved area, and it had two, three, four, five houses on it, and they were all owned by the family. All of them were family members, except for our house that we were renting. We were not, and that's when he said, "Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. You know, you're hearing this coax cable for the TV antenna. When the wind blows, it's just smacking the side of the house. That's all it is. You're all good. Don't worry about it." Oh, okay. So feeling pretty good about that. Um, it was at that point um, I told my dad, hey, I'm not going to give away any names. I'll call him Henry, if you will. I said, hey, Henry, who lives down here, had told me that this is what's going on, blah, 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 blah. So my dad's like, all right. Now, this is Friday afternoon, got home from school. And mind you, we're going into winter. It's getting dark real early. And he says, okay, well, I'll tell you what. He says, tomorrow morning we'll go out there and we'll see what we can do to take care of this so we don't have to listen to this racket waking us up. Oh, okay. Saturday morning came. I'll never forget this nice sunny day, and it was weird for December. This is right before Christmas. We went out there and we're looking, and he's like, what? He goes, where the hell do you see a coaxial cable? He goes, I don't see anything. And my dad at that point, he's like, what the hell is going on here? Um, my dad at that point said, well, it's got to be a loose piece of siding, and it's got to be something. So he had called the landlord. The landlord came out, he looked at it, he said, it's nothing. He's like, you guys are probably hearing a mouse or something like that. You probably got mice. We're like, no, we don't have mice. We would know if we have mice. We would see droppings or something. We don't see any mice. So As the winter progressed on, this just kept going. It would start out and it would be a constant, it sounded like a banging on outside of the house. And the weird thing is, the minute you would sit up, till you got to the point to where you just couldn't take it anymore, it would stop. You'd lay back down, you'd start to get ready to fall back to sleep again, and at that point, it would start again. So by the time late winter came around, we all kind of learned to ignore it, if you will, and just try to sleep through the night without it. And that's when we started to hear the stairs that went upstairs, and we would hear them creak like somebody was walking on them. Now, we had at that time when we moved in, we had two dogs, and we had one that was a Bouvier sheepdog mix, which that's a pretty big dog, and the other one was a beagle, which was a smaller breed. So at first, I assumed it was the dog walking up and down the stairs, and that's what we were hearing. Um, it wasn't until, and we still never figured this out, but our dogs were scared to go upstairs. They would never want to go upstairs whatsoever. And my mom, because the dogs would always like to sleep next to my mom, so when she would go upstairs, she would notice the dogs would always cower at the bottom of the stairs and be like, mm-mm. And they would sit downstairs and they would howl and bark at night. So it was at that point that my mom started sleeping on the couch downstairs, kind of like the try to keep them from barking um, and howling. It was at that point, I'll never forget this, and I remember my mom calling up to my dad because she heard somebody walking up and down the steps, assuming it was me or him, neither of which we were sleeping. And this continued on. This, same as the knocking. The minute you sat up, the minute you got to the point to where you just could not take it anymore, it would stop. The minute you laid back down and you decided it was time to just put it behind you and try to go back to sleep, it would start again. So things continued on like that throughout the winter. Um, it seemed like getting towards the end of the winter, beginning of the spring, things tapered off a bit, almost like as if whatever it had been um, might have just like that was it. And life kind of seemed like normal for a while. So as spring of that first year came around, and a couple of things had wound up happening, and I don't think we realized it at the time. It was just kind of like this really, really bad streak of luck that seemed to affect not only my parents and me, but also my brothers and sisters as well. So the first thing that wound up happening was my brother David had it's always kind of a lead foot. He always drove pretty fast, and so anyways, this is in Michigan. He was hanging out with a few friends, had a few beers, was heading home, going a little too fast, and got pulled over. And they said, "Hey, we smell alcohol." Ultimately, to say he got charged with a DUI, lost his license, and everything else that comes along with that. So it was at that point, well, he needed help, and we had the basement. Nobody was really using the basement at that point. And my parents said, "Well, hey, why don't you move in here? Um, and you can either get a spare bedroom upstairs you can use or the basement." Well, my brother David decided, hey, let's use the basement because he could turn it into kind of like his own little apartment down there. And so I remember first moving in, didn't like the basement, just didn't like it. Um, So my dad said, well, we got to go down there and we got to clear this out and we got to open it up so he has a place to live. So we went down there, and when we moved in, my parents, when it was us three, really never, besides my mom going down there to use the washer and dryer, nobody really spent any time down there. It was just for storage. You'd go down there and drop whatever off and forget about it, more or less. And so there's always this room that was paneled off, and we never really could figure that one out. But my brother Dave stopped by, and my dad and my brother Dave said, well, we're going to take care of this and open everything up. That's the first time when everybody kind of said, what the, basically. Because this area that was paneled off, that seemed like they had no way to get into it, had a little access door that once you remove this piece of paneling, you could see that was high enough for somebody to crawl through to get into, but it was empty. It was at that point, my brother Dave had crawled through, went in there, and kicked the paneling out so we get in, and we had gone in there and tore down this paneling, opened it all up, and opened the room up. And Lord behold, to our surprise, which made no sense, was there was a light fixture, an old school light fixture that had the pull cord for the light that was in the middle of this room without a light bulb. So we had put a light bulb in that, obviously, lit up the room or the area, and our basement opened up. After that had happened, things just gotten worse, um, exponentially. So my brother moved in, and with that, I was happy because I always looked up to my older brother. My older brother was always my hero. And so he moved in, and he was cool as hell. He had this big, expensive Bose stereo system. Um, he had a huge TV with an entertainment center. I mean, it was just like going from upstairs to where here's normal everyday living with the parents and going downstairs and hanging out with the big bro. And, you know, it was just like, um, heck yeah, rock on. So at that point, we had noticed um, the stair thing, the knocking thing started to pick up more and more and more. To the point, I remember my brother bringing that up. Like, he's like, who the hell was running up and down the stairs all night long? Well, you know, when I told him, and when I said this, I said, hey, I think this house is haunted. Um, I was laughed at. Everybody told me, no, it's not haunted. It's your imagination. Can you guess what they said? They said it's those role playing games you're playing. It's at that point dementing your mind and it's twisting your perception. So as that year, as the spring had worn in and it started to get warmer, and I'll never forget this. That night we are supposed to have a lunar eclipse, and as promised, we could see the moon out our door wall. It was huge. It was beautiful. We were able to see the lunar eclipse and sit in the kitchen. It was at that point my dad was sitting next to me, and sitting next to him. My mom, I remember, was listening to the radio, and she would glance over every once in a while, but she had her headphones on, just kind of doing her own thing because my mom's cousin was a professional DJ, and she would listen to his shows and at night. And he worked for WRIF in Detroit, WW4 Country for a while, and a couple other stations. You may have heard of him. Have you ever heard of the disc jockey Rob Bennett? And You heard of my mom's cousin. So, anyways, um, she would sit and listen to his shows, and on the property where where the kitchen was, and then you had the living room off of that, and there was two windows that looked out to the rest of the property that was fenced in. There was an old tree, and there was a makeshift um, tree fort that somebody had built at one time, and it had all but collapsed to just the floor that had a chunk of plywood that had rotted away with a big hole in the center. It was utterly useless. But anyways, that night I happened to glance over and I saw a silhouette standing in there. It looked like a person standing on it. So I told my dad, I'm like, look, I'm like, there's somebody out there. And he's like, what? And he looks and he's like, what the hell? So he grabs a flashlight and he told me to stay there, you know, because I was going to go with him. He's like, no, you stay here. And he went outside, and I seen him walk out there with the flashlight and look around and come back. And he's like, "There's," he goes, "I didn't see anybody leave," but he goes, "But whoever it is, gone." So it was at that point, um, pardon me, oh. It was at that point I had realized that um, I was convinced the house was haunted. I was, that was pretty much all the proof I needed to see. And I even told my dad, I think our house is haunted. My dad, who was trying to be the voice of reason, and I get it at the time, we had nowhere else to go. So it was very hard um, just for him to say, well, let's just pack up and leave and go somewhere else, because we couldn't. That wasn't an option. And he just reassured me. He's like, no, I'm sure it's somebody else out there just playing games on us. That's all it is. So when I went to school, I went to the library, and at the time, there wasn't a whole lot you could find on this topic that was based in reality and wasn't fantasy. It was a very, very small um, pickings, if you will, from the library at school. But I did find a book, and I read through it, and it explained about how these paranormal researchers, basically, how some of the tricks that they would use to disprove a real haunting from a fake one, if you will. And one of the things in there they talked about was using sand, how they would put sand or baby powder or talcum powder over the floor and see if there's footprints. Obviously, if you're dealing with something that's not really there, it's not going to leave prints like a human being will. So I told my dad about this and I showed him, and you know, he read it and he's like, well, sand is cheap. He goes, let's go to the hardware store. Let's buy a bag of sand. He said, spread it around. He's like, we'll do you one better. He says, we'll get a piece of plywood, and he says, we'll throw it over the top of that, and we'll put the sand there. That way, you know, hey. So that's what we did, and that was a Saturday project. We had put a piece of plywood over where it had a hole, and I had layered that sand about 2 inches thick as it recommended, smoothed it all off. And then the author said you should put something in there. Put in, you know, draw something in there that you know, keep it to yourself, don't tell anybody else. And if it's disturbed, because I said if somebody walks across it and they have something to smooth it back out, you'll never know. But if you were able to put a print in there, something that you know that you can do, but it's going to be hard for somebody else to duplicate, at that point, well, there you have it. And now we're talking about early 90s here. So yeah, at that point I had gone in there and done my little curly Q thing with a stick, knowing right where it was at, and left it. Later on that night, my dad's watching television, and I hear him call me. I come downstairs. My dad was a huge Star Trek fan, loved it. I mean, he watched it all the time. So I came downstairs, and he's sitting there, and he told me, he's like, "Look outside. What do you see?" Looked outside, and Lord behold, there's this figure again standing in there. And I said, "It looks like somebody's standing there." He goes, "Yeah." He said, "I just noticed it." He said, "Let's go take a walk out there, see who it is." We go outside, come around the house. As we get close with the flashlight, it's gone. Look at the sand, no prints, no nothing. At that point, my dad had a little, how would you put that, change of perspective, if you will, as to maybe there just was something going on here. He didn't want to talk about it. And he told me, he says, "Ignore it. Don't talk about it anymore. I don't want to talk about this anymore." He says, "Just leave it alone." So that was his answer. We ignore it, it'll maybe go away. Well, that plan didn't work. Um, the thing with the stairs creaking all night long as you lay in bed, it sounds like somebody walking up and down the stairs, up and down the stairs, constantly until you sit up and you can't take it anymore. Then it stops, and then the banging on the wall. And then this. Well, up to this point, and I promised my dad I would not say anything to my mom, and I didn't, about what we saw in the tree stand. So my mom didn't know about this. So as we're getting into the summertime now, I hear my mom call me. So I answer, and I'm like, "Yeah." She's like, "Come here." So we go upstairs into the spare bedroom. And as we're standing up in the room, she's pointing out in the field. She goes, "Do you see that?" And she's pointing out, looks like silhouettes of people standing in the tall grass. And this is an old, at this time, it's been developed now, but at this time, this is an old gravel pit that they had hit the, I'm guessing they had hit the water table for whatever reason. They abandoned it and they didn't finish with it. But you can get the point. It's undeveloped land that's very, very rough terrain, basically, to walk across. It's tall grass, it's trees. I mean, and then it just goes to a massive drop off. And so I said, "Yeah, I see it." And she says, "So you think these are your, are these your friends?" And I'm like, "Well, what do you mean by that?" And she's like, she was insinuating to the fact that it might have been a couple of my friends trying to pull a prank. And I told her no. I bit my lip. I didn't tell her. So as time goes on and it gets dark, she's noticing this stuff. And now she tells me, she's like, "Well, come here." And this is like a couple weeks down the road. She says, "They got flashlights. Look at that." And you could see these dim lights that would move through the grass. Um, you would see the dim light move, and then it would fade out, and it would reappear, then it would fade out. So what I had read out of that book, and they were explaining this weird energy, this unexplained, if you will. And I was telling her, I'm like, "I don't think those are flashlights, Mom." And she's telling me, "No, I'm telling you right now, those are flashlights. I know a flashlight when I see one." Well, I'm not going to argue with her. And she sees what looks like these people that are crouched down staring at the house. And she's like, "I've had it. I'm calling the police." I said, "Okay." And I told her, I said, "The police aren't going to find anything." And she's like, "You'll see." All right. This is what started our relationship with the Wixom police. So the Wixom police show up, and my mom's explaining to the police officer what she's seen, and she walks him upstairs to the spare bedroom, points out the window, and he's like, "Whoa, I see that." She's like, "You see that?" He's like, "Yeah, there's somebody kneeling down." And he's explained to her, he's like, "Well, have they done anything?" Like, and she's like, "No." He says, "Well, technically they're not on your property. If they're not really doing anything to harm your house, there's not really a whole lot we can do." He said, "But what I'll do is I'll just take a walk through the field and see if it scares them off." So my mom and me stood watch. He walks around in the field with his flashlight, and as he gets close to where this thing is, Lord behold, there's nothing there. He comes back to the house and he says, "Well, I don't see anybody out there. I don't see any tracks. I don't see anything." He says, "Maybe it's just a trick of light and shadow that we're seeing." And my mom's like, "No, I'm telling you, saw it. I saw it. You know what we saw." So the officer's just like, "Look, I don't know what to tell you. I got better things to do. I gotta go." So at that point, um, things kind of changed. My of my sisters, I got three of them. One of them, she kind of had her marriage went through a rocky point, and her and her husband separated for a brief amount of time. And at that time, she moved in with us, or moved back in, I should say. And she just recently had her first child, and so she took over the spare bedroom. She slept upstairs. And I remember her asking me, "What's wrong? What's wrong with you?" She's like, "I notice you're always just like looking around, like expecting something to happen." And that's when I confided in her, and I told her, I'm like, "Look, this place is haunted." And she laughed at me. And I said, "Okay." I said, "You believe what you want to believe." I'm like, "After you've been here for a little while, you're going to see some things you can't explain." And I said, "And you'll figure it out." So she thought it was funny at first. And it wasn't until she started complaining I couldn't sleep last night. She says, "I heard the dogs or somebody walking up and down the steps all night long, and it sounded like somebody was banging on the wall." And she's like, "Every time I got up, it would seem to stop." And she's like, "It would go." So for all of us, we're just kind of like, yeah, yeah. Um, so what she really noticed was she would set something down, whether it be her cigarette lighter, her car keys, and she would walk back into the kitchen and it'd be gone. Lord behold, she would think my mom picked it up, I picked it up, somebody else picked the stuff up, and we couldn't find it. We would tear apart the furniture, tear all the cushions out of the couch, would look everywhere, look underneath the furniture, everywhere. You would not find it. And then a day or so later, Lord behold, it would just turn up. And it would turn up in the most bizarre spots. Like, you walk into the bathroom, and if you were just in there an hour later, you only remember things being on the sink, such as hand soap, stuff like that should be there. And you walk back in and you see a cigarette lighter that's set right in the middle of the sink. Just to give you an example of the way things would happen around that place. So it raised a lot of questions, a lot of, my sister's like, at that point, she's like, I believe you. She's like, "There's something here." Well, then my mom started to say, "Do you see that? Do you see that?" Because my mom really started to notice at night these, as she put it, pardon my French, YouTube, I hope I don't get censored here, but she would say asshole kids that were running around trying to basically get some cheap thrills by scaring us and the neighbors. Um, yeah. And the more and more she would watch this, the more and more she would walk away with no explanation. So, Lord behold, another one of my sisters, because my sister Debbie had reconciled things with her husband and they had smoothed out their issues and she had moved back in. And my sister Tammy had moved back. And things changed. She had her kids with her. And so at that point, we had the distraction of the kids around the house now. And my parents were distracted. I was distracted for a while. And we kind of forgot about all this crap that was going on. Um, and it wasn't until we were all sitting at the table, and man, I'm getting goosebumps thinking about this right now because um, we were all sitting at the kitchen table and we were all talking, and my sister brought up about the stairs, about the knocking, about I don't get. She's like, there's something going on here. She's like, I set something down, I walk out of the room, and I come back and it's gone. And I know nobody else has been around here. It was at that point the front door, and I will never forget this, busted wide open. We had a gust of wind that came in. I remember still to this day, it's giving me goosebumps. The leaves that blew into the kitchen and swirled around the kitchen as we were sitting there. And then, just as if it came in, the gust went right back out, and the door, bam, slammed closed. I remember telling my parents, this place is haunted. There is something here. My dad tried to explain it as a pressure difference between the inside of the house and outside of the house and a gust of wind. And I'm thinking, I'm like, how? How does that happen? Uh, With all the other storms we've had come through here, this, and then it closes the door. My sister, she was just like, this place is haunted. She's like, there's something going on here. My mom said, nope, it's an old house. There's nothing going on. There's a reasonable explanation behind all of this. So at that point, things begin to escalate. Now, along with listening to the stairs, the banging on the walls, seeing these silhouettes outside, you would hear the TV turn on. You walk into the room, the TV turns off. Then you hear the radio come on. Whether it was my mom's radio in the kitchen or my stereo upstairs, you go heading up that way, it turns off. The night that before things really got bad, and I mean really bad, and we haven't got to that point yet. This is just scratching the surface. I remember my dad came home from work. He had worked late that night. He was tired. The only thing he wanted to do was grab something to eat and sit down in front of the tube and, hey, I get that. So he had walked over, turned the TV on, and he had sat down, and the TV turned off. He looked at it, he's like, what the hell? He gets up, walks over, turns the TV on, walks back over to his chair, because this is before remotes, sits down, TV turns off. At this time, he's getting real pissed, and I just remember at that point, I don't know why he did it, but he did. And he challenged whatever was there. And he says, God damn it, stop it right now. I'm sick of this shit. Turn my TV back on. As he went to go stand up from the chair, the TV turned back on. I remember it turned back on and then it started changing channels. My dad went to walk over to that TV, and as he went to go reach it, and I still remember this to this day, you could hear the crack of what sounded like static electricity, and then that TV went out and it never came back. Um, that was pretty bizarre. Me and my mom were sitting there looking at one another like, I mean, how do you explain that? So at that point, my mom had called a TV repairman because at that time that's what you did. It was cheaper to have it repaired than it was to just purchase a new one. TV repairman came out and looked at it, and he's looking at it and he's telling us, he's like, I've never seen this component go out this way. He says, in all the years I've been doing this, he's like, I've never seen a capacitor do this. He was like asking us, he's like, did you guys like, did the house get struck by lightning? We're like, no, there was no lightning. And he's asking all these questions, and he's like, I have no explanation. He says, I've never seen that component go out like that. And if you're telling me that the house didn't get struck by lightning, he's like, I don't know how to explain that. He had replaced the component, TV was back up in business. But that didn't stop it from turning on, turning off, turning on, turning off. So, as this is progressively happening, I never talked about this at school or with anybody else, but it was affecting my sleep, began to affect my grades. And a guy I grew up with, really cool guy, and his dad owned a excavating business, and he always worked with him. After school, he was always working. I mean, God, he worked hard. And but anyways, his dad, for all his hard work, bought him this really cool dirt bike, and they did what they had to do to make it street legal, and you know he had his, technically, as they considered it, moped license, which I think it was technically more than a moped. But anyways, he had brought it to school, and he said, "Hey," he's like, "instead of riding the bus, you want to, ride home?" And I'm like, "Oh heck yeah!" So he gave me a lift home, and I said, "Well, hey," because he says, "Why don't you come over to my place to hang out? I'll drop you off later." And I said, "No problem." I said, "Let me drop my books off," and I said, "Leave my mom a note, let her know where I'm at." She wasn't home. There was nobody home but me. Um, because that day I remember she had to take the dogs to the vet, and there was something else she had going on. I remember she had to do something with the dogs in the vet because the dogs weren't there either. The house was completely empty. So I had come into the house, wrote a note, dropped my books off, grabbed my coat, went back out and locked the door. And as I'm walking out, he's sitting in front of the house and he's waving. And I walk up to him like, "Who the hell are you waving to?" He looks at me and he goes, "What are you talking about?" He goes, "Wasn't that you up there in the window?" I said, "No." So that wasn't me. I said, "I was right here in the kitchen. I was leaving my mom a note." So now he's looking at me. He's freaked out. He goes, "You're telling me right now you weren't up there in the window?" I said, "No, I wasn't up there in the window." And he says, "I saw somebody up there in that freaking window that was looking at me waving." So it wasn't me. At that point, he goes, "Get on. Let's get the hell out of here." So, anyways, there was that experience. And then at that point, he had already figured it out. Later on, he talked to me, and he's like, he kept saying, he goes, "Are you sure? Are you 100% positive that it was?" And I said, "Yeah." And he never came over there again. That was it. He wanted nothing to do with that place. So as the school year went on, because this is going into the fall when this is happening, two of my friends that I went to school with, they rode their bikes over to my house after school. And we had this horrible storm blowing. Lightning, thunder, high winds, the whole 9 yards. They're putting out storm warnings over the radio, telling people to look for cover because possible tornadoes. And I remember my mom saying, "Hey, once the storm clears, I'll give you guys a ride home." Um, they had called their parents, let them know what was going on, said, "Hey, we're in a safe place. There's a basement here. If something happens, we can seek shelter here. After the storm blows over, um, we'll either ride our bikes home or, his mom will give us a ride home." So it was at that point we still had power. We had went upstairs and we were listening to music and we were hanging out upstairs in my room. We are talking, got the stereo going, and I remember, never forget this. So all three of us here would sound like my mom calling my name. Not once, not twice, three times. And at that point, um, I remember I turned the stereo off. My friend Brian said, "You should probably unplug it." He goes, "It's getting worse, man." And he says, "If the power spikes, you don't want it to blow your stereo up." Now, the reason behind this, my parents had got me this real nice stereo for Christmas. And this is when compact disc was like relatively new. I actually had a compact disc player. So if something was to happen to that stereo, it's not like I would get another one anytime soon. So I said, I agreed with him. I'm like, yeah, that's a good idea. Turned the radio off, unplugged it from the wall, went downstairs, and it was at that point my mom had laid down on the couch and listening to the rain and the wind and all that. She had fell asleep, I guess. Anyways, I had woken her up. And I asked her, I said, "What do you want?" And she's looking at me all confused. She's like, "What the hell are you talking about? What do I want?" I'm like, "You called me." And two friends over here, Brian and Justin, are both like, "Yeah, you called. What, we heard it." Um, my mom insinuated I was on drugs and that all three of us were on drugs. And we were just like, "No, we heard you." My brother Dave was in the neighborhood, and because he had just recently, at that point, got his legal issues figured out, had a vehicle again, got his license again, his independence, if you will, and had just recently moved out into his own place and was in the neighborhood because the weather was so bad and decided to stop in to hunker down for the storm. So he comes in and he walks in the middle of this. And my mom says, "We'll talk about this later." Fine. Now they're freaked out. We're My brother shows up, and at that point my friend Brian and Justin have not met my brother. I introduced them, and we hear the stereo upstairs. And it's loud. It's blaring. My mom is pissed off, and she's looking at me. She's like, "Why are you blaring your stereo?" And I'm like looking at her. I'm like, "How can I be blaring the stereo if I'm here with you?" So she thinks it's me trying to set all this up to scare my friends or something. And she thinks that I've orchestrated all of this. Anyways, I go upstairs because these two don't want to go with me. They're petrified. I mean, they are literally petrified. I go upstairs, Lord behold, there's the radio playing away. As I walk into the room, I'll never forget this. I just had that overwhelming, sick feeling like you know there's something there. You know there's something there watching you, and there's nothing you can do about it. Um, Furthermore, brings the question of when you know you unplug something, how is it plugged back in? I had ripped the plug right out of the wall. Um, didn't even bother turning the light off and just went back downstairs. By the time I get back downstairs, my brother is standing in the living room and he points out the jackass friend of mine standing outside in the treehouse in an electrical storm. As I try to explain to him, Dave, there's nobody there. I'm telling you, there's nobody there. That's not what you think it is. He decides he's going to prove me wrong. He's going to go outside and catch this snot-nosed punk and teach him a lesson or two. My brother Dave goes out into the rain, into the wind. He comes back in, and he has the look on his face of surprise because there's nothing there. As he says, I don't know how they did it, but they managed to get away, but I didn't see them, but I didn't know how they did it. The power goes out at that moment. Everything goes into darkness. At that point, I just remember having the overwhelming feeling that whatever it was in that house, it was getting ready to show itself. And it was done with us. Because this is going into the second year. My friend Justin and Brian, they're literally so scared. I mean, they're on the brink of tears. Um, the odd thing is, at that time, the electricity was down, but the phone still worked. I remember Justin calling his dad and pleading with his dad, crying over the phone, just come pick us up. We can't stay here anymore. My mom got on the line, gave him directions how to get there, and Lord behold, within about 15 minutes, he was there. They loaded up the bikes and they were gone. From that point on, they, both of them, and have never gone back to that house, anywhere near that house, to this day. The last time I had talked to Brian, which was in my adult years, which I was 28, 29 around that time, I ran into him and I was talking to him and I asked him about it. And he said, you know what? He said, I needed parts for a truck that I was putting back together. He said, I found one pretty reasonably priced for the truck. He says, and then I looked at the address and I saw where it was at. He said it was down the road from where that house is at. He said, I'm not going anywhere near it. So still to this day, I'm still that way to this day. So at that point, my brother David's convinced it was one of my friends. My mom thinks that it's me trying to basically scare everybody, trying to set all this stuff up as an elaborate, you know, scare-a-thon, if you will. And I'm trying to convince her it's not me. There's something in this house. So after this little wave of terror happens, things kind of calm down for a bit. Things kind of get back to normal for a while, like how these things work. And it isn't until going into the third year and going into, which would have been early autumn of that year. At this time, my mom had acquired another dog, and we had 3 dogs at that time. And, man, I'll never forget this. So it started out with the dogs going berserk in the backyard. And behind our house, which was fenced off, it was just weird. There was what they call this little summer cottage. We, as the renters, were never allowed to go near it. We had no access to it. Um, Nothing. We didn't know anything about it. We were told you don't go near it. So dogs are going berserk. My mom looks outside, and we see orbs of light moving through. I mean, they're so bright. They're literally, as these things pass by the objects inside of this, are casting shadows on the walls and everything. You can see these things coming up through the roof and going back in. Mom's explanation: flashlights. Gotta be. So I am pretty much at the point, I am just scared beyond scared. I am terrified. And I'm telling my mom, it's not flashlights. Do you understand? It's haunted. She gets pissed off with me and she says, I'm going to call the police. And I was like, what are the police going to do? I'm like, what are they going to do? And she's like, well, they'll catch who's ever. And I'm like, who's in there? Who do you see? Who do you see right now that you can point out and say, right there? And I said, they're not going to do anything. So she decides to call the landlord. The landlord comes over because he's in the neighborhood. And anyways, he pulls up in the driveway, and I will never forget this till the day I die. He gets out of his truck, he looks, and he's terrified. He just looks at my mom and he says, I'll be back tomorrow. I'll take care of it tomorrow. I can't deal with it right now. Speeds off out of the driveway. Gone. At that point, everything kind of just fizzles out. Next day, landlord, true to his word, comes back and they're taking stuff out of this house. And I remember he's asking me if I want any of this stuff. And I didn't know what I was looking at that time. I was too young. And it wasn't until I got older and a little bit wiser to know what it was. And it was ceremonial, ritualistic, occult things that you would use as far as incense burners and candle holders and pentagrams and all these other weird fucking things that he had. And he was like, well, do you want any of this brass? Do you want any of that? And I'm like, no, I don't want anything. I was thinking at that time, I don't want anything that came out of that house. Nothing. Nothing. And he's like, well, you can scrap it and get good money for it. I'm like, nope, don't want it. So they had cleaned everything out and gotten rid of it. Um, Within about 2 months of that happening is when I'll never forget this. The dogs once again are going berserk. The dogs are looking out at the forest. They are freaking out. And I'm trying to get these dogs in because my mom's worried the neighbors might complain about them. It's at that point when we hear what sounds like a frantic woman screaming out, I'll never forget them words, help me, oh God help me, please help me. My mom says, get the dogs in the house, I'm calling the police now. So I'm trying to drag these dogs in. Now mind you, at this point, these are our dogs. I'm used to seeing our dogs, but these dogs are so insistent at what they are seeing and barking at, and it's freaking me out because I'm not seeing anything, but their hairs literally, fur I should say, because they don't have hairs, literally almost standing on end. As I get these dogs into the house and we're locked in, it was just at that point I told my mom, I'm just really worried. This is it. I mean, whatever it is coming. My mom says, it's kids. I'm telling you, they're going to catch them this time. Police show up, explain the story to the cop. Cop's looking at me. Oh, yeah, it's probably one of your friends with a bullhorn hanging out in the. And I'm thinking, no, this is Michigan. This is in the fall time. When the sun begins to go down, it gets cold outside. I don't know too many people that are going to say, hey, you know what? I'm going to go rustling through nasty, wet, mucky mud swamp area with a bullhorn and hang out in this cold, miserable weather just to pull a practical joke on this guy. It just didn't jive with me. So he's explaining all this, that he knows what it is. He thinks, and then it's at that point you hear it again. But this time the cry's a lot closer to the house and it sounds way more desperate. The officer at that point jumps on his radio and he calls for backup. That night we had state police. The state police had sent out a helicopter with the searchlights that searched the wooded areas. They also sent out 2 K9 units. We also had the Oakland County Sheriff's Department out there. We had the city of Wixom, city of Novi, also had shown up. And there was one walled lake. Needless to say, there were cops everywhere. They were walking through these fields. They had flashlights. They had dogs going through it, helicopter running back and forth. They had this forest just lit up. As they start to, one by one, leave, and it dwindles back down to the original cop, my dad's coming home from work because he had made the transition, decided to start working afternoons from days, shift premium, a little bit more money, if you will, which my parents needed at that time. So he's coming down the road, and the cop's getting my statement, and he's talking to me. And Dad pulls into the driveway, and now he's talking to the police officer, and he's like apologizing to him, telling him that, oh, he's got a huge imagination, and it's these books he's reading, and it's this and it's that, and it's nothing there. It was at that point, and I have never experienced anything like this since, and I hope never to. Best way I can explain it to you is imagine having something stare at you, but not like, you get that freaky feeling when you know somebody is staring at you that is just bizarre and weird, or you get that feeling that that person wants to do great bodily harm to you. That's the feeling I had. It felt like dread and the uttermost amount of hatred towards me. I was stricken with fear. The only thing I could do was smack my dad on the shoulder. I'm just smacking, 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 smacking. He's talking to the cop. He turns around. He's like, "What?" And I pointed. My dad looks, and he doesn't know what to say. The cop turns around, and there is this black silhouette standing at the end of the road. I'll never forget this. Cop pulls the flashlight out. He turns it on, and he's shining it. And the light is not reflecting off of this thing. It's just blackness. It's nighttime. It's dark. We're out in the wooded area. With the only lights are the lights that are on the homes to light this up. And this thing is blacker than that. And he says, "I want to talk to you." And he takes 2 steps towards this thing, and it just... The cop at that point tells my dad, "There's something going on here. There's something definitely going on here." And he says, "But I think you need help from a higher authority, if you catch my drift." At that point, he looked at me and he says, "Don't call for anything here on out. We don't care what you see, what you hear. Don't call us." Jumps in his car, gone. And when I say gone, I mean at a high rate of speed, rooster tails coming off The back of the wheels of the squad car gone. At that point, I knew I couldn't stay in that house any longer. I was coming apart at the seams. Um, Later on that evening, and it wasn't until we had actually left and my parents finally found a house where they wanted to live further out, the next county over, out in the sticks, that my dad had told me. Later on that evening, he had laid down in bed and he thought my mom had come to bed to join him because he could feel the bed rocking and moving around. So at that point, he didn't really pay that much attention until the point he felt the covers drawing tighter and tighter around him. And he was laying on his back, and it was at that point he opened up his eyes and looked. And from what he could see from the light coming in from the hallway light, two footprints that were standing on either side of him, the mattress pushing down. And when he went to go sit up like that, it was gone. It was at that point that that wasn't all my dad could handle anymore. Aside of those being more of, as you would put it, the noteworthy things that happened there, you would hear, you would swear at times, you would hear what sounded like people having conversations. And you'd walk into the room and there's nothing there. You would walk into certain areas of this house and it was just cold. Didn't matter what time of year it was. It could be 95 degrees with 100% humidity outside where you're just sweating, and you walk in and you'll hit certain areas of the house and it's just cold. But with that being said, my parents decided it was after the third year that it was time to go. They've had enough. I've had enough. And I'll never forget this. Yeah, it was so weird. So we're moving stuff out, and just like it was weird. 3 years to the day, Thanksgiving Day, Thanksgiving weekend, if you will, we're moving. And I remember we had the last load to put in the van. My dad said, go inside, make sure you got everything, and then we're out of here. He says, I don't want anything else to do with this damn house. Went inside, I made my quick sweep, looked around as long as I could take it because it was just horrid. It was bad at this point. To the point when you were in the house, you would hear the doors upstairs slamming. It was like at that point, whatever was there just didn't care anymore. It was making its presence well known, and it didn't care. We went back out to the van, and Lord behold, the right rear tire was flat on the rim. My dad, I'll never forget, told me to stay with the van. He was going to walk down to the neighbor's house, and he was going to call and see if he could get someone to run a tire out to him, or at least figure out a way we get the tire fixed. He was able to get hold of my brother, and they worked things out. And I remember him telling me, we'll be right back, just stay here. And the kid that, as I called Henry in the beginning of the story, that lived there, had come down and was talking to me. And I'll never forget, here it is over the Thanksgiving weekend, and we just had this weird, weird storm that came in. It looked like a cyclone, not a cyclone, but like a tornado, I guess, if you would say. And it was just this column of weird spinning clouds, and it began to snow. And it was so weird, it was so out of place that people were literally like pointing, talking about it. They had come back with the tire, they had thrown the tire on, and as we're pulling out and my dad went to go turn, we get stuck in mud and the van's just spinning. And my dad's like, "You gotta be kidding me." It was almost like whatever was there was like, "You ain't gonna get out alive." At that point, friend Henry, me, my brother, a couple other people that had came over that lived on that street that could see what was going on, were helping push to get the damn van out of the mud. And at last, it went. When we had got to the point that we had pulled off of that side street on the Potter Road and we're starting to leave, and I was looking at that road in the distance, if you will, of the mirror, that I took a big sigh of relief. It almost felt like this is it. The nightmare is over. So we moved to the new house, and the first year, everything seems to be normal. Life's better, things are new. Um, and it's weird, almost as if, like, whatever it was came back just to remind us that it's still here. Nothing like what we had experienced in the other house, but every once in a while, something would be removed, only to find it reappear again, some weird spot that you don't remember putting it. Hear a door close. Um, I remember one night, and this is when me and my wife first started dating, and we had come home, and my mom was sitting frightened. And it was one of the many few times in my lifetime I can remember seeing my mom, honest to God, frightened. And I asked her, I'm like, "What's wrong?" And she's like, "Well, either you or one of your friends decided to come here and you know, pull a practical joke and I don't appreciate it." And I'm like, "What are you talking about?" She's like, "I heard somebody running around on the roof, and then somebody screamed down the chimney of the fireplace, 'Hello.'" I, I'm looking at my mom and I'm like, okay, I'm like, first of all, I was like, nobody's going to get up on this roof without a ladder. That's just going to happen. I'm like, second of all, none of my friends that I know of would do that. They got better things to do besides running around on top of our roof and screaming down our chimney. Um, just not going to happen. So, towards the winter of that year, my wife decided to stay the night over, and I had taken a job at that time, and this is before I got into turning wrenches as a mechanic full time, but I took a job working security on the midnight shift in a factory that was within walking distance of my house. And we had a snow that evening. I'll never forget it. Came home, walk in, and she's sitting on my bed, terrified. Just absolutely terrified. And I'm looking at her, I'm like, "What's wrong? What's going on?" And she says, "Best way I can explain it to you is," she says, "I heard a sound that sounded like," she says, "a horde of demons, if you will." She goes, "This screaming and everything that sounded like it came right up to the house and then it stopped." So I'm kind of like, okay, okay, I'm believing what she's saying, but you're kind of like, Okay, I said I'll go out and I'll look around. I'll see if I see anything. Well, we've had a fresh snowfall, so I went out and we had an extensive line of property. It went back. It was like 3 acres, if you will, long. It was about a quarter acre wide that ran back. I had walked the property. It was a beautiful morning. It wasn't really that cold. We had a fresh snowfall. And as I'm walking, I'm looking at the ground and I don't see any tracks. I don't see anything. Um, as a matter of fact, I remember finding it kind of odd that morning that I didn't even see deer tracks because deers would move through there almost all the time. So I thought that was kind of odd, but didn't really pay a whole lot of attention to it. So I had walked around, I had looked, I had come back into the house, and I told her, I said, there's nothing out there. There's no tracks, there's no nothing. And it was at that point I heard exactly what she heard. And as the way she's explained it is what it sounded like. And just as she said, once it got up outside the window, it stopped. Every now and then, small little subtle things will happen. A few years back, I'll never forget, my daughter had a pair of those sneakers where you step on them and you stomp your feet and they light up and they got the LEDs that go flicker everywhere. And came home from work and my wife and my daughter were asleep in bed. Um, remember getting out of the shower and going out to make myself a bite to eat because it was a particularly long day. And in our very far living room, which we call the fireplace room, where there was nobody, as I'm standing in the kitchen island and I'm preparing my food, I see this light out of the corner of my eye, and as I look, these sneakers are lighting up. And I'm thinking, that's odd. So, first I'm thinking it's got to be the dogs. As I start to approach, it stops. I go in and I'm looking. I don't see the dogs. I don't see anything. Pick the sneaker up. I'm looking at it. And as I'm just pushing with my thumb, I can't get it to go off. And I smack it on my hand real hard. It goes off. So I chalk it up as low batteries. Set it back down. I go back into the kitchen, go back to doing what I'm doing. And it goes off again. Um, every once in a while, things seem to drop a subtle hint. It's almost as if, like, if you've ever had an experience like that, it's something you'll almost carry with you for the rest of your life. Not 100% sure about that, but at this point, I'm now 45 and it sure the heck seems like it. So, with that, everything I told you is true. It happened to us. The house, like I said, I will not give away the address. Um, that just doesn't seem right, particularly if people are living in it right now. Um, but the last time I checked public records on the house, the last people to own it stayed there for exactly 3 years. They owned $140,000 on their mortgage and they had got up and they had fled, leaving all their possessions behind. So, just a word of caution. If you decide to go and visit any of these places, if you decide to maybe try a ghost hunt, if try to contact the other side, if you will, just remember one thing: these things are real. Sometimes these things will follow you, and there's really no way that I know of that they just seem to go away. They seem to rear their ugly head every now and then to let you know that they're still there. So, with that being said, my friends, I'm going to end my story here. Hope that gives you something to think about. With all that being said, Happy Halloween, my friends. This is Artichoke Dip, signing off.